Good evening, everyone, from me too. Welcome to the fourth Belgrade Legal Theory group meeting in the series of State of Emergency. Today, we have an honor to host Balázs Fekete from Hungary, Center for Social Sciences, Institute for Legal Studies within Hungarian Academy of Sciences, Center of Excellence, who will present our topic, a state of emergency in Hungary beyond the dictatorship narrative, facts, text analysis. As you already know, first 30 minutes will be dedicated to the presentation, after which we will have another 30 minutes for the discussion. You will find the reminder of our rules in the chat box. Boyan can also once again put them because something went wrong. But basically, or most importantly, you are allowed to ask questions by raising your virtual hand. Or if that doesn't work, you can maybe type your comment or question in the chat box and Balázs will address it. So without further ado, Balázs, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I'm so happy to be here, although that's only a virtual meeting, but at least we can do something and we can meet. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy of this opportunity, and not only literally saying, I'm so happy that you freed me from the quarantine, at least for this presentation. I will share sometimes my slides, but I won't do it during the whole presentation. So first, I would like to start with a remark that perhaps my the title of the presentation might be strange, but it has its reason, because simply I'm really, how to say, I'm really unhappy with the narrative actually going on the Hungarian affairs. And what I'm trying to make here is to provide a deeper and somehow more refined insight to the actual Hungarian affairs than just simply declaring that it's about a dictatorship or something like. So this is the reason behind the quite provocative title of my presentation. Then I try to share my first slide. Hopefully it will work. Yes. So the structure of my presentation, as you can see, first I will speak of some basic facts. I don't want to, I would say, overestimate the role of these facts, but I think they are worthy to be mentioned. Then I will move to some relevant legal texts just to introduce some measures taken by the Hungarian government. And I think thereafter will come the two interesting part, or the interesting or intriguing part of my presentation, since first I would like to analyze these measures in the light of the so-called autocratic legal principle or autocracy as such. And I will argue that what has been going on in these days or in these months in Hungary is a real stress test for rule of law and democratic political culture. And if I can save some time, then I will present you with totally fresh socio-legal research insights, because I've been carrying out legal anthropology research in the last 2 months, and I would like to share some insights coming from this. So now let us see the facts. Just a very stupid question, but I know that it should always be made during that kind of virtual meetings. Can you hear me clear? Everything is fine? Okay.
Maybe you could just full screen the presentation. I don't know whether the people who are watching on phones can read everything.
Yes, I will try. Then we will see what goes. Yeah, that's the beginning. Okay. Then I will keep the presentation and we will get back. Okay. So, in brief, some basic facts, and these are the the latest data, the data of today. That, as you can see, in Hungary, in the last 2 months, there haven't been too many cases as compared to the general setting of the pandemic in Europe. We have a bit less than 4,000 confirmed cases. As you can see, almost 2,000 people already recovered, and we still have a bit more than 1,300 active cases. And what is interesting, just with respect to the data, that the death ratio is relatively high. As you can see, that a bit more than 500 persons died in the coronavirus. And this means that the ratio is much higher than the world average, being around 7%. Yesterday's data say that it's a bit more than 13%. So it's a very interesting setting. I don't know what is the reason. I should have mentioned beforehand that I'm not an epidemiologist, neither a constitutional lawyer, but then I will talk about this later. And what is also, I think, typical, but should be mentioned, that basically mostly the elder people have been affected so far. As you can see, almost 80% of the victims were older than 60, and that's also data of yesterday. So the coronavirus had an impact on the Hungarian population, for sure, but this impact, I think, cannot really be compared to what happened in Western countries, for instance, in Italy or France or in Belgium, where perhaps the situation in the language of numbers was the most serious. I have a timeline because it may help to understand what has happened in the last 2 months in Hungary. The symbolical starting date of the coronavirus pandemic in Hungary was 3 March, because that was the day when the 2 first cases were officially confirmed by the public health authorities. And what is interesting, that the 2 first cases were 2 Iranian university students, one of them pharmacologist, another one from the Faculty of Medicine. And they were both back directly from Tehran, from Iran. So officially, in official terms, we consider 3 March the start of the pandemic in Hungary. But actually, there's a huge project called H-Uncover, which is a nationwide representative coronavirus screening program. Very interesting. Unfortunately, I won't speak of it, but they came up already with interesting findings. And one of their findings was that the leader of this research program declared that that's rather likely, or very likely, that the coronavirus has already been present in Hungary during February. But we consider March 3, the 3 March, the starting point. Then, in a relatively fast manner, the government declared the so-called state of danger according to the Hungarian fundamental or basic law. I will call it constitution later. And as you can see, that was quite a fast reaction, with special regard as compared to the reactions of Western European governments. March 15 March was also an important moment in the containment process with respect to the coronavirus, since that was the day when the government decided to close down all elementary and high schools. And they declared what we not really welcomed as parents. I have personal experiences since we were at home with 3 boys. That the education would continue in a digital form. And the university education had already been closed 4 days ago. And the next step of the governmental measures happened or occurred on 27th March, when the government introduced the lockdown measures. I will talk about them later. And perhaps the most infamous or famous or interesting, or I don't know, but most important day, if we consider the whole process as a constitutional process, was 31 March, since that was the day when the government decided to enact the so-called enabling act that gave rise to a huge wave of criticism coming from both internal and foreign sources. Then what happened? 5 May is an important day, since that was the day when the decreasing of active cases started, and it's been continuing from 5 May. The day before yesterday, 26 March, the government submitted a proposal to the parliament to terminate the state of danger, and practically it also implied that it will seize any extraordinary powers of the government that comes from the extremely criticized Enabling Act. And just for fun, I have a fun fact on this declaration, that our Prime Minister first on 15 May in Belgrade during a press conference mentioned that he's really that he was willing to repeal the Enabling Act, and he's really willing to give back all the powers provided by this act. And although this is not mid-June yet, I have to mention that if the parliament votes this proposal, I'm sure that they will do, since the governing party has a supermajority in the parliament, then the state of danger will terminate on the next day of the enactment of this act, and this will be in mid-June. I think experts say that the whole process will take about 2 weeks. So this is a timeline. This is our chronicle for the events. And now I will move to some legal texts. First, I would like to start with explaining some constitutional provisions. I hope, yes, sorry. So, just some kind of introduction that actually, I think this is not so essential from the point of public discussion, but it's essential from the aspect of constitutional discussion, that actually in Hungary there is no state of emergency. What we have is the state of danger. And the Hungarian constitution, I realized it because I'm not a constitutional lawyer. That was long ago when I was studying constitutional law. Basically contains many forms of state of emergencies. And the regulation of this topic is rather complex because of that. We have state of national crisis, we have state of emergency, we have state of preventive defense, we also have state of terrorist threat, we have state of unexpected attack, and we have this state of danger. And what I have to mention is that although I'm not a constitutional law expert, as I already told, my impression is that in this list, the state of danger is the so-called weakest component, because here the merging of legislative and executive branches of the government is not implied, because in the other forms of the emergency, state of emergencies, it is required to set up a so-called National Defense Council, and this council merges these two branches of the government. But here, this is not the case. So let us check briefly what the state of danger means in Hungarian constitutional law. First of all, who can make it? Who can declare it? The government may declare it. Then when can it be announced? here, that's an important point. There are two not conjunctive prerequisites. First, it can be declared in the event of a natural disaster or an industrial accident and then endangering life and property of the population. What is interesting that some Hungarian constitutional law experts argued that if we have a close reading of this text, it can be argued that the proclamation of this state of danger is unconstitutional, since the pandemic cannot fit neither to the frame of a natural disaster nor the frame of an industrial accident. I don't know. And they also argue, some of them, that what is happening because of this disharmony can amount to a constitutional crisis. Maybe, perhaps. I don't think so otherwise. Why can this state of danger be proclaimed? In order to mitigate the consequences of the natural disaster or industrial accident. And what can the government do? And this is the essence of this problem. They have two options: may introduce extraordinary measures laid down by Cardinal Act. So there might be other acts somewhere in the Hungarian legal order that contain relevant measures as for the state of danger, or, and I think this is the most important point here, the government may adopt decrees by means of which it may, and now watch out, suspend the application of certain acts, derogate from provisions of acts, and take other extraordinary measures. So basically, this state of danger provides an opportunity for the government to rule by decrees during the state of danger. However, these decrees may be enacted. These decrees that will be enacted during a state of danger have a force limited in terms of time, because they can have their legal force only for 15 days, as you can see here. The Constitution says that the decrees of the government shall remain in force for 15 days. Unless the government, on the basis of authorization by the National Assembly, extend those decrees. And in any event, they cease to have any effect when the state of danger is ended. And of course, this end has to be proclaimed again by the government. So that was the constitutional framework used by the government when making the containment or when fighting against, because they also like to use this term, the coronavirus or COVID-19. However, during the last days of March, an unexpected problem came up. The problem was that basically, if these decrees have only 15 days time force, then what will happen if the 15 days expires, but the coronavirus still remains with us? And in order to solve this problem, the government came up with the concept of the Enabling Act. Normally it was called Law 12 of 2020 on the containment of coronavirus. And this act contained a clause that gave rise to extremely harsh criticism coming from abroad and coming from internal sources. First of all, it's very interesting, but many Hungarian constitutional lawyers compared this act and the effect of this act to the so-called Ermächtigungsgesetz. Sorry, my German is not perfect, but I think you know what they wanted to mean by this. And many European organs and the civil liberties watchdogs raised various rule of law concerns, because they argue that this act will give extraordinary powers to the government, and these extraordinary powers will be practically unlimited by time, because there was no clause in the act when will this whole enabling act, the force of this enabling act end. So let's have a closer look on this act. I have to mention that it's quite a short piece because it has only a preamble and 10 sections and only 10 pages long, the whole stuff. So as you can see, section 2.1 basically specifies that the government will hold all these powers. And here you can read the key element or the key component that in order to guarantee that life, health, personal property and rights of the citizens, and to guarantee the stability of the national economy by means of a decree. And then you can read the same formulation, the same phrasing: suspend the application of certain acts, derogate from the provisions of acts, and take other extraordinary measures. So basically, these extraordinary powers that came from the state of danger have been prolonged to an unlimited or uncontrolled time. However, there were two restrictions included in the act. The first is quite a considerable restriction as for the material scope of these extraordinary powers, because it can only be, or it shall be, exercised with respect to the mitigation of the effects of the containment. As you can see, section 2.2. And these measures should also be necessary and proportionate to the objective pursued. So, although there was no obviously time limit as for these these extraordinary powers, it couldn't be stated, I think, that it was practically unlimited, because even the act contained some strong limitations. And section 3.1 specified that this extraordinary power will be enforced until the end of the state of the danger. And of course, the problem was here, and it's a relevant question, that if the government is to proclaim or declare the end of the state of the danger, why and when will the government declare, argued the criticism, the end of the state of danger, since these extraordinary powers create quite a manageable situation for the government to act without parliamentary control. And as you can see in section 8, this act can be repealed by the National Assembly. And now where we are, if we look back to the timeline, is that the government has already submitted the proposal to terminate the state of danger. So practically in 2 weeks term, the whole situation will end. So these are the facts and the legal texts. And there's a huge wave of criticism, but at this point, let me deviate from the quite conventional criticism raising the rule of law and other kind of concerns. And the first thing is that I will approach what has been happening from the aspect of the so-called autocratic tradition. But at the very beginning, I have to mention that now I don't use this term autocratic tradition as a political philosophical term in which autocratic tradition or autocracy is used as a apparent opposition of liberal democracy, basically the two ends of one scale, liberal democracy and autocratic tradition. But I would like to use this term to describe a specific Central European historical phenomenon. Here you can see the photo of the wonderful László Péter. Unfortunately, he was a Hungarian historian who was working during his lifetime at the UCL in the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And he was, hard to say, but that's true. He was an expert of modern Central European and Hungarian history. And what is interesting in his oeuvre, that he used lots of political analysis when trying to describe the modern history of Hungary and Central Europe. And he had one key term, that was autocracy. And basically, now I will put a long story short, so obviously, necessarily, I will move only on the surface, but I hope I can explain what I would like to mean here. He argued that autocracy as a political tradition in British terms, is basically has long been the most influential political tradition in Central and East Europe. So the starting point here is something different, that basically for László Péter, the starting point is that if you want to understand the development of the political regimes and the political development of the countries of Central Europe, first you should accept as granted that the ruling and the dominant political tradition in this region is autocracy. What do we mean by autocracy? He has a wonderful, more than 30 pages long study on it. I will only take one sentence out of it. He argues that the essence of autocracy is the irresponsibility of power without any external control. And the main form of autocracy in this sense is the existence of discretionary powers, especially regard to the enactment of government decrees. So rule by decrees, rule without consulting the National Assembly is somewhere the essence of autocracy. And what is also important that autocracy as a political regime obviously can have lots of geographical versions and also lots of historical versions. So this embraces a wide variety of political regimes, and he even submits that the quite strange term democratic autocracy also already existed in Central Europe. Why this is important? Because as for the law, the most important point of autocracy in the interpretation of László Péter is the existence of the so-called autocratic legal principle. The question here, this is also a British concept, so that's why I'm really fond of his work, because he tried to use British, he tried to apply the British understanding of political and legal culture to Central European issues. It is argued by László Péter that the essence of or the main meaning of the autocratic legal principle is that the presumption of lawful acting is not on the side of the people, the citizen, as it's been a case in England for a very long time. Just think of the works of Dices, for instance, or the work of the courts. But this presumption is on the side of the state. As you can see, I summarized this in two sentences. Basically, according to the so-called presumptio iuris, according to the Western approach, people are free to do anything unless an act of the parliament prohibits to do something. But in autocracies, and therefore in Central Europe, the approach of the role of law is different, because here the state, and here Péter László means the so-called military bureaucratic state that has roots in Prussian statehood or in the Habsburg administration. So the state, in this sense, is free to do anything unless an act of the parliament or the courts prohibit to do something. And what can law do in this situation? And this is the very essence of the German rule of law concept. Otherwise, that the role of law is to prohibit to interfere with the civil liberties. And these civil liberties are also declared by these acts. And why this is important in the case of coronavirus and the state of danger in Hungary. Because first of all, Péter László, in his wonderful piece, argued that autocracy and the autocratic legal principle have never been ceased to exist in Hungary, and it has always been a strong component of Hungarian public and bureaucratic thinking. Even during the socialist age, because the socialist constitutionalism know the so-called decree with the force of an act, what is the essence, again, this so-called autocratic legal principle. And the constitutional and legal reform that started following 89 can also be understood or can also be regarded as a great try to deconstruct the previous autocratic power use by using many insights coming from rule of law theory. But it should also be admitted, argues Peter László, that this process remained and it should have necessarily remained unfinished. So what is the situation if we take the Google of László Péter with respect, Googles of László Péter with respect the coronavirus pandemic, that the overwhelming victory of the Fidesz in 2010, do not forget that they scored supermajority during the general election, created a positive context for strengthening the governmental powers and thereby making them more efficient, because efficiency is also an essential point of autocratic governance. And I think the state of danger can also be interpreted as a further step toward more autocratic use of governmental powers. Do not forget the text of the act, because it says that the government may adopt decrees by means of which it may suspend the application of certain acts, derogate from the provisions of the acts, and take other extraordinary measures. And I think because of that, the entire situation that is going on right now in Hungary, in this historical term, and in a constitutional perspective, can be understood as a stress test for the otherwise weakened Hungarian rule of law and democratic political culture. And my quite provocative conclusion at this point is that the first round has just been won by the rule of law, since, as you can see, the state of danger will be put to an end in 2 weeks. However, in the act declaring the end of the state of the danger, the government will introduce a minor state of emergency. This is the state of public health danger. It hasn't been existed so far, and so surprisingly, it will give, if it is enacted, by some conditions, as for instance, if the WHO declares that the pandemic exists. But if it is declared, it will provide with some rather similar powers the government, with special regard to issuing decrees to fight or to do the containment. Oh, I have already run out of my time, so I will have only 2 sentences. So my conclusion here is that this history-inspired interpretation may show that although it was quite a hard situation from the point of view of constitutional issues, the first round has just been won by rule of law and democratic political culture. And just one tiny addition, that very easy to consider the Hungarian situation in a quite simple way. And this implies that everything has been done by the government and people only do react to the acts and to the orders of the government. But my microanthropological research showed something absolutely different. At some key points, people, the families, the Hungarian society started to act much earlier than it's been ordered by the government. This was the case as for the closure of schools, because at the very beginning of the pandemic, the government doubted whether it could be an effective measure, but parents and some parents started to recall their children, while some principals decided to close down the school, although it was prohibited by the ministry. And this is the same for the wearing of masks, because at the very beginning, even the highest public health officers argued that mask might be not really useful. They questioned the use of it, but people started to wear masks from the very beginning of the pandemic, and now it's quite a broad custom. So my second point is that if we consider these micro findings, one may argue that society can have a much stronger and effective impact on governmental policies and on the acts of the government in this crisis situation. And my conclusion won't be such a thunderstrike. Things in this crisis situation seem to be much more complex than just to describe them in very basic terms like the emergence of dictatorship or the overwhelming victory over the virus or a constitutional crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Balázs. It was a really interesting presentation, and that is even more so since I do believe that we can draw some parallels between problems that you have presented and the situations that we had in our country in the last 3 months. Anyway, now I'm opening the discussion, and the first question is from Theodora.
Hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Theodora.
Hello, Balázs. Thank you very much. Insightful presentation. Much important these days.
I'm afraid that I cannot hear you.
Maybe I should. I apologize. Do you hear me now?
A bit better.
Okay, I'll try to speak loudly. So thank you very much for this insightful analysis. I think it's much needed today when we talk about Hungary and the whole, as you titled, leadership discourse. As a matter of fact, I highly agree with your findings, also these anthropological findings, because it happens that at the time of the pandemic, I was living in Budapest, and I highly agree that international sphere, it was somehow depicted as if in Hungary is, I don't know, some kind of constitutional crisis, that the government is constraining people. Well, that just didn't happen, in my opinion. I think that the Hungarian government, like if we only look at the measures that they imposed, I don't think that there were any kind of autocratic tendencies there. And as you said, mostly those were the people who started. So in that sense, I really think it's important not to, how to say this, not to ascribe everything the ordinary politics. Like this crisis in specific, yes, it had an impact on the whole constitutional crisis, which is happening in Hungary years now. But I don't think that, I agree with you that this comparison to the Enabling Act, German Enabling Act, is way too overhead and definitely over exaggerated. My question would be, since in your analysis, you were mentioning autocratic design, autocratic system. What do you think? This is just my opinion, because I'm studying, my field of expertise is liberal democracy. And what do you think about the concept of a liberal democracy? What do you think about this whole academic discourse that is flourishing the last years? That's first question. And the second question, I also agree that your findings, that we have to look at the specifics, that can be transposed to the whole Orban's government and the whole Orban constitutional change. Because for example, even if we see the constitutional changes that they brought up since the fundamental law, it is very hard to actually point the exact thing in the constitutional changes of Orban's government that undermine the rule of law. So that is, I think, the reason why EU is struggling with Hungary that much, because if we, from constitutional point, take measure by measure, amendment by amendment, and break it into pieces, we can see that they're not much different from any other change that happened in, I don't know, Germany, France. So all of the other countries had the same amendments, and it happens that in Hungary, it's the discourse that actually drives that how to say, crisis. So, or also we can mention the Sargentini report, which was a major failure in my opinion. Exactly why Sargentini report was a failure, because I read the response of Hungarian lawyers to Sargentini report, and I must say that they were quite good, if not amazing. Orban's lawyers, in the sense that they really explained legally that there is nothing wrong in Hungary in this legal sense. So this problem of actually finding how the rule of law is violated, I think that we could see this in emergency situation even more, because if the health of people is in danger, it's really questionable if we can discredit any of the measures, which in my opinion, as a citizen of Budapest at the time, were quite reasonable. So my question is, what's your opinion on that? What do you think about the liberal democracy discourse? What do you think about the rule of law? Do you agree with, I don't know if you're familiar with constitutionalists such as Gábor Halmai and all the other group who have very firm opinion on what's happening in Hungary. In our school of thought, we perceive that decline of rule of law with much skepticism, because it's not. I mean, it's easy to say there's dictatorship, there is liberal democracy, but when it comes to legal evidence, we are left without words. So I'm just curious, what's your opinion on that?
Do we collect other questions, or I can answer now?
I think that you can answer now. Bojan is the next, but maybe he can wait.
Okay, so thanks for the questions. That I'm afraid that a complete discussion of all the issues you raised would take a very long while. We would sit here for hours. So I'm trying to be as conscious as possible in this case, but I'm open for further discussion because I agree with you at many points as a Hungarian. First of all, the illiberal democracy discourse, and I think this also implies the validity of the rule of law discourse as a problem. I don't like it. This is very personal, but I have serious doubts on the validity and relevance of the illiberal democracy discourse. But what made it relevant was, you may remember that in 2014, our Prime Minister declared in a public speech in Tusnádfürdő, this is a place in the heart of Romania, in the Hungarian region at the Székelyföld, declared that the Hungarian political system is not a liberal but an illiberal political system. And when he declared it, the whole liberal side of the foreign audience jumped on this term. And a very renegade interpretation of Orban's speech. Basically, he did not want to use illiberal democracy as a term. He did not want to use the term of illiberal democracy in a Western sense when he was speaking of the nature of the Hungarian political regime, but simply when he used this term, he wanted to mean that we go contrary to the former liberal socialist way of political thinking. Because till the victory of the Fidesz in the Hungarian public life, the liberals had very strong impact, mostly in intellectual terms. And what Orbán wanted to emphasize here is the fact that he, as a politician, wouldn't accept this way of very liberal thinking, but in Hungarian terms, not in the terms as it is used in the Western political and legal scholarship. But that's not the first case when someone is misunderstood. So basically, the term illiberal democracy with respect to Hungary had swiftly its own life, and now I think the whole discourse on the Hungarian situation is trapped by this term. This is my opinion, and this was the reason partly that I chose to came up with with László Péter's insight on the autocracy as a political regime, again in historical terms, not in political philosophical terms, and the autocratic legal principle, because I wanted to free the discourse on Hungary from the trap of this illiberal democracy, rule of law concerns, and the dictatorship concern. So basically, I don't find it useful at all, because if something is the Hungarian political system, for surely it's not an illiberal one. Now, my friends being subscribed to the liberal side would kill me in this very moment, but I agree that we're not an illiberal democracy. and the second, that I agree that you can argue that all the measures introduced by the government have been rather similar to the measures in Western Europe, the measures introduced by Western governments. But I think in the last years, and that's also due some mistakes and faults of the government, Hungary acquired such a bad image that basically we cannot break out from this. So anything we do is a threat to democracy. Anything not we, but the government do is a threat to democracy. It's a huge attack on rule of law and so on and so forth. But I think this discourse is also a trap, because if you take into account the analysis of László Péter, you can argue that the nature of the Hungarian political culture and the nature of the Hungarian legal culture, or the Hungarian constitutional culture, has a strong autocratic dimension too, besides the rule of law dimension. So basically, what I'm saying here is that I think it's a relevant scholarly task to detect, to identify the autocratic elements, again, in László Péter's terms, not in political philosophical terms, as with respect to Hungarian constitutional law. And it's a very valid thing to have a discourse on these components. But that's something else than crying out always for the death of Hungarian rule of law and the death of Hungarian democracy. And I agree with your opinion, if I understood it correctly, on the Sargentini report. As a Hungarian, that was quite funny to read what happened in my country that I didn't detect at that time. So these were it was in Schlagworten, my answer. I don't know whether you are satisfied with this or not.
Okay, thank you, Balázs. We are not allowed to have follow-ups, so I suppose Theodora is satisfied.
You are so strict. You are so strict.
Yeah. Now I give the word to Bojan. He also has a question.
Boyan,
by making
unmute. Unmute, please.
I'm unmuted. Yeah, it should be unmuted. With Boyan's clear autocratic tendencies, but in making the rules of this group. I want to push you a bit also, Theodora, but Theodora is not in the position to answer on this point. Nowadays in Serbia, we have been discussing, of course, also if there was, because our legal system allows for different legal regimes when you have pandemics, but we chose, or the government chose, the legal regime of the state of emergency. So there was talk about maybe choosing an unsuitable legal regime. But if we set that aside, and if we say in a Schmittian manner that eventually the choice of whether a state of emergency is going to be declared or not is on one single or multiple decision makers, we could say, okay, we are stuck now, whatever the reasons are, in a state of emergency. But when a thing like a state of emergency emerges, actually, I think that the predominant question becomes one of use and misuse of the states of emergency. So no matter the framework from which you assess the workings of a state, if it's a conservative or liberal or classical liberal or non-classical liberal outlook, one thing I think cannot be plausibly denied, that states of emergency can be misused in order either to gain short-term effects or to establish long-term effects in terms of the functioning of the government. And I was mostly interested because, of course, I was following most of the time when it comes to news from Hungary, I was following the standard media coverage of Hungary. And what was present in that media coverage of Hungary was a set of decrees that were actually enacted during the state of emergency, but didn't have much to do with the very state of the emergency and with the pandemic. So now if I was to cite those decrees, I wouldn't be able to. It had something to do with the property of a town. You probably know what I'm talking about. So my question is basically that. So in the framework, in the constitutional framework of the state of emergency, how much of the emergency powers were used? And you said good things, and also Theodora said good things about the use of those powers in terms of them not being unproportional, let's say, or at least within the bounds of what the European countries were doing. But what do you think about this other part, if true, if existent, with the misuse of emergency powers? Thank you.
So I don't want to use big words, we say in Hungarian, but I think misuse is, or the possibility to misuse is the very essence of political power. So I think it's a very general political philosophical question. And I agree with you that if this kind of state of emergency is set up, but I should remind you that we had the softest version of state of emergency, the state of danger in our case, then there's an inherent danger or threat to misuse it. And what is interesting that you mentioned some decrees, you know, the seizing of some local governments' wealth and giving some buildings to friendly groups like foundations and things like that. But what is interesting that all these you were reading about were not dealt with by decrees, but by acts enacted by the parliament. So it's a very interesting bifurcation of the things, how things go in my country, that I think this state of danger, I'm enough there to say it, has not been misused at all. Because just I have a short list what kind of decrees have been enacted based on this extraordinary power. For instance, the closure of schools, the banning of public gatherings, the rules for the Kurzarbeit, the 6 months moratorium for any loans, or the basic rules of social distancing, and so on and so forth. So they all perfectly fit into the frame of the state of the danger. But in the meanwhile, the parliament had held sessions, and they enacted acts that can and that should always be questioned and discussed and disputed. And there were, I agree, some very problematic points. For instance, as a university people, I have to mention that during the pandemic, the crisis situation, the parliament adopted an act about changing the form of financing of 6 universities. They were put out from the governmental regime, and the foundations were set up to finance these universities. So there were many changes happening in the background, but these were not made in the frame of the state of the danger, but that was the normal way of Hungarian parliamentarism. So what I would, I think it must, a clear distinction has to be made. Or politics, as a very internal affair, have not ceased to exist at all in my country. And of course, these developments can give rise to very serious concerns. But the decrees all fit into the frame of the state of danger.
Okay, so thank you, Balázs. Well, if there are no, there, Professor Jovanovic has a question.
Hi, Miodrag. Haven't seen you for ages. Unfortunately, I cannot hear you.
We're not hearing you, Professor.
Okay, now?
No, I can. Hi, Miodrag.
Hi, Balázs. Thank you for this this great presentation, and especially for trying to somehow provide a different angle from what is now a dominant perception of the Hungarian situation. I won't say that I don't share much of the general attitude towards Orban's government, but I would like to hear your comment on a completely different matter, which might be, at least to my mind, quite illustrative of the characteristics of this of Orban's regime, of some of its very strategic maneuvering, which is far from a simple ideological or whatever label which is often put upon this government. And this concerns the latest reaction to the European Court of Justice, or the Court of Justice of the European Union, in the case of the of this transit zone asylum seekers camps, namely the reaction to the court's judgment was swift and obeying one, in a way completely contradictory to the overall attitude towards the government as the one that is constantly undermining rule of law and a liberal or constitutional democracy, and so on and so forth. So I'm just interested in your opinion. Can we draw some kind of a general or more general attitude from or conclusion from this reaction to the court's judgment? Thank you.
Thank you, Mirodrag. Let me be honest. I was surprised by the government's reaction. And to be honest, I was very satisfied with their steps that they basically banned and put to end all these transit zones, which I found absolutely unhuman and contrary to all human dignity. But you know, the problem is that it's very hard to set up a conclusion based simply on one fact or one event. And I have a positive and a cynical interpretation of what has happened with regard to these transit zones. The positive and legalistic interpretation is very simple, you know. Basically, all the judgments of the European Court has to be respected. Perhaps even in Germany too, I don't know. But you can argue that they simply obeyed to the decision of the European Court of Justice. But I have a different, and this is not really cynical, but to some extent, that never forget, and I think it can be acknowledged by those who, to be polite, have very serious concerns of the Orbán regime, and especially with regard to our Prime Minister, that Prime Minister Orbán Viktor is a great politician, and I think behind the decision can be a political insight to that hard times will come in the European Union. However, the Union will introduce some measures and some extra support for the reanimation of European economies, and to have a bigger part of these sources than expected, we should show up as good guys, not the black sheep of the European Union. Because right now, I think you will laugh on it, but I had the impression that in the last years we were the Serbs of the European Union. I think you can understand what I mean. So I think what they did was rational. It was legal, and never forget, our Prime Minister is a political mastermind, I think.
Okay, thank you, Balázs. So now we do not have any more comments. I think we can conclude. Thank you once again, Balázs. This was really interesting and thought-provoking. And thank you everyone for being here with us, for participating. We hope to see you next week. This goes also to you, Balázs. Feel free to join us.
I really try.
We will get next week, same time, same place, and we will be discussing the state of emergency in Poland. So until next week, stay safe, and we will see each other.